Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to my interview with psychoanalyst and author Stephen Grosz on his book, Love's Labor: How We Make and Break the Bonds of Love. My name is Rodrigo Barahona, the book review editor for the Psychoanalytic Quarterly. It is my pleasure to be here with you all and with you, Dr. Grosz, and to have this opportunity to get to know you and to talk to you about your new book.
It's a pleasure to be here too, Rodrigo.
Well, let's jump right in. I wanted to start by telling you just how much I enjoyed this book. Your previous and your first book, The Examined Life: How We Lose and Find Ourselves, was the way that I, probably many of us and many of the readership, got to know you as a psychoanalyst and as a writer. You write about your work as a psychoanalyst, the people that you see and have seen and worked with over the years. And you do so with such a tremendous respect for both the profession and those people whose analysis you've undertaken. You write and you think deeply about their predicaments as analysans and people in relationships with themselves and with others, and your predicaments as their analyst, trying to understand and communicate experiences that quite often are very difficult, or elude, articulation and language. You do this so well in that book and in this second book, Love's Labor. Here, in Love's Labor, you give us more of yourself, I think, although you're generous in both of these books. In The Examined Life, you write about how people lose and find themselves, while here in Love's Labor, you help us think about how people lose and find the other. So it's a slightly different focus. I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how did you come to writing this second book?
That's a really good question. Um, I'll tell you the difference between the two books first, I think. I've been thinking about, while you were speaking, I was thinking about that. The first book is 31 stories. Most of them are about my cases, one or two about personal things with my family and so on. Um, in the first book, I was trying to talk about things which really struck me as an analyst. Um, I was aware that most people, you're an analyst, most of the people who read my books are probably not going to have an analysis, but I wanted them to have an idea of what happens. And part of that was personal. I had young children. I wanted them to have a sense of what I did all day. That was part of the thinking behind it too. But I also wanted to record it for myself and the things I was thinking about. So the first book included a lot of things which problems I will never have, problems in my child patients, adolescent patients, adult patients. Love's Labor was different. I wanted to write about love, not as it's in popular culture, but as in our consulting room. I'm so aware of your chair back there behind you, that your analytic chair where you will sit. The things you will hear that are so different than the limited and limiting narratives of popular culture, the things which I felt I heard from my patients, that I felt also my friends told me, that I felt I'd experienced in my own life about about love's fragility, the difficulty, the joy of love. That meant in this book, um, I had to show a bit more of myself because to not do so would have been a kind of timidity. Even I have fallen in love, Rodrigo. And, and so you have to show a bit of that because everyone has. I'm someone who believes you only believe a book if you believe the narrator, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. The narrator has to be truthful or show themselves truthfully on the page. And so I wanted to say enough about myself so that my readers understood, felt that I was telling them from the heart, speaking to them truthfully, about both myself, but also about my patients. So the book does, you're absolutely right, it's a bit more personal. Um, but to not have been a bit more personal would have been cowardly, I think, as a writer. And I think that's always the great uh, challenge, I would say, in writing. Fear is the one thing that stops writing. If you have to overcome anxiety and fear, I think, to get it onto the page properly.
Yes, there's something there about bringing yourself more forward in this book. I think something about wanting to communicate who you are to your readership, to your loved ones, and I think something about authenticity. I
Yes,
think that which is a theme that does come up in this book. You are, in terms of who you are a psychoanalyst native of the United States who emigrated to the UK to do your studies, I think, and later your analytic training. In your chapter, you have a chapter in the book called "Going Home," where you mentioned that you're originally from Indiana.
yes.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to the UK and led you to stay there and create a life for yourself.
Um, it's nice speaking to an analyst, to a colleague, because you will understand that I was born in the Midwest outside of Chicago in Gary, Indiana, northern Indiana, and went to Berkeley and then to Oxford after that. And uh, a friend of mine who I had breakfast with, who went to Yale, who's been here 40 years, John Lahr, who was a theater critic for the New Yorker, is one of my oldest friends. And I thank him in the book. He's always encouraging my writing. Um, John talks about those who have achieved escape velocity and those who haven't. uh, and that we are two who, many have tried, he'll say, but only a few do achieve escape velocity. And it's sort of, it's a psychical force, I think, as well as anything else, that escape velocity. So there was something of that. I say in the book at one point, I loved my parents, which I very much did, and they were wonderful people in many ways. But because of personal things, which I describe a little bit in the book, I didn't altogether trust them. Like so many people who become analysts, like so many of our colleagues and friends and ourselves, uh, we're trying to understand that, our relationship to our family and all that. So uh, my father was from, it's now in the Ukraine. It was Austro-Hungarian, then Czechoslovakia. It was this little bit of land in the Carpathians. Uh, Most of his relatives were killed in Auschwitz. Um, and my mother was, her family was from Russia originally. She was born in the States. And they were hardworking Midwesterners. My father owned a grocery store. And, but like so many, very invested in education, very invested in learning and reading and thinking. So, yes.
Okay, okay, and in terms of your investments, you've been a psychoanalyst for a long time. When did you think about writing and being a writer?
Well, the analysis part, I should say something about too. That came really early. My brother, I have an older brother, he was at Berkeley before me, and he was reading the interpretation of dreams. I think I was 16, he was 20, and he gave me a copy, and I found that completely mind-blowing. Um, and I was really quite hooked through my undergraduate years. The people I studied with at Berkeley were all interested in politics and psychoanalysis. It was the late 60s, early 70s, when all those things kind of came together in very powerful ways. Um, I I wrote analytic papers, so I did the training, and then my first paper was in the International Journal. I don't remember if it's 89 or 90. I think 80. It's fairly early, but it's on an HIV patient that I had in 5 times a week analysis. Uh, And I think that was the first paper. And it was, as we write in the journals, it had the patient's history, the history of the analysis, some sessions, and then trying to understand the analysis in an analytic way. And I wrote like that. I wrote book reviews. I wrote for some of the journals. I did things within the society. I think it was only when I was 50 that I started writing. I started my analytic training, as I described in the book, when I was 31. With my training analysis, I described the beginning of that in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but I wanted to write differently. I wanted to write in a way. I'd been teaching a course at UCL in the psychoanalysis unit on the case history. There were a couple of things came together. I was doing that. My wife did comp lit at Oxford. She's a Proust scholar, but she also translates from the German. She's just finished translating Thomas Mann's Death in Venice for Oxford University Press. But we met because she was translating Freud's studies in hysteria for Penguin Books.
Um,
And her reading and us discussing studies in hysteria, my teaching for 10 years about the case histories led me to start seeing that I might write about them in a different way, in these short, that you could get rid of a lot of, in terms of confidentiality, you could narrow it down to the most important analytic moments, which is what I decided to try and do, to give that sense of what was happening in the session. And I thought about it a lot, and I started writing these short pieces that were no more than 1,000 or 1,500 words in length, which were like little case histories or little vignettes from analysis, but that I felt kind of captured important points. So that I was 50, but The Examined Life was published when I was 60. And then for the next 10 years, I worked on this, again in my spare time, just thinking about the cases which I thought I wanted to bring into the book. And I'm now 73. So,
yes, yes. So you give your work quite a lot of thought,
yeah,
and you take your time. And in this short format, or the format of the short vignettes, you are able to capture, I think, in such intricate ways, like the basic elements of somebody's psychology, but also the psychology of the session, which is very, I think, very interesting. And I think in Love's Labor in this book, you also go into more detail about the theory. If I might be incorrect about this in relation to the examined life, but it seemed to me in reading the second book that you talk a little bit more about the theory of doing the work. You show, in doing so, you show deep regard for the features, of the psychoanalytic work, some of which are unique and even strange, even in the therapy world. The frame, for example, the psychoanalytic frame and the setting of the encounter, and how important that is in order to help a person be able to make contact with themselves and with their analyst. The couch, too, the analytic couch. You mentioned the chair, for example, right? I mean, the chair, the analytic couch, right, is something that you mentioned at the start of both your first book and in this one. I think when you were describing the way that you do your work in the first book and in this one as well, you mentioned them in ways that are interesting. And the couch is something I think even 126 years after Freud introduced it, it brings up so much mystery to people. It's so misunderstood. Right?
yeah,
I listened to an interview on NPR a few weeks ago with Jodie Foster talking about a movie
yeah,
that where she plays an analyst, and her and the interviewer began talking about the couch, and they talked about it as something rather frightening and kind of arcane. It seemed to me. But that's not the way it comes across in your writing. I think you introduce it with such unassuming care. You write about how your own analysts introduce you to the couch by gesturing to the chair, and then to the couch, suggesting that the couch might be more comfortable, which is,
Yeah.
yeah, I wonder if maybe you could say a little bit more about that moment. I think it's such a touching moment. And also your thoughts on the couch and the peculiar yet unique analytic frame and the setting and what it means to you and the work that you do.
Yes. Again, another very interesting, very good question. Um, I'll never forget. I mean, a lot of the things I put in the book, I put in there to kind of remember and to hold on to. But I try to describe that day when I was 31 years old, more than 40 years ago, when my analyst, it was raining outside, it was icy cold, and it's Upper Wimpole Street, which is in the Harley Street, the kind of medical area of London. And I think the thing which struck me was the modesty of the room. The building was rather two doors down is where Conan Doyle lived, writing Sherlock
Wow.
Holmes. And there's a blue plaque there that says, Conan Doyle wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories here. As a medical practitioner, as I think he was there. Um, so but the room, the waiting room had a coal fire. So it was so English, and so somebody coming from the States. It was January. It was coal fire. The room had a kind of modesty. What I felt and what I wanted to capture was that feeling that I had, the bustle and the noise and the cold outside, and going deeper into the building, into this little room that was quite modest, very small, and but there was a couch, there was a chair, there was only one. There was his chair behind the couch, and you're right. He absolutely said, "There's the chair, there's a couch. Make yourself." I think the couch is more comfortable. And of course, I laid down, and I described this in the book, completely surprised by bursting into tears. When I've had a couple patients who had a kind of very emotional reaction to laying down, and it was clearly the relief of, oh my gosh, this is the beginning of 5 time a week analysis. This guy is really serious, and he's here to think and to listen and be here as long as I want to come. We'd had a couple of preliminary meetings. He'd been one of my interviewers for the Institute. It was Adam Limentani, who was president of the IPA at the time. But again, the modesty of him in his room. And my other interviewer was Hannah Siegel, Hanka, and they both had admitted me on my first interviews. And there was just something about the acceptance and the feeling of, you're home, this is it, we're here. And it was profoundly moving. As I go on to say, that didn't stop me giving a performance for some time of being the ideal patient in a hope that he would take a shine to me. And what I describe in that first chapter of submitting or being submissive in the analysis, rather than, as you would understand, properly emotionally surrendering to the process. And it took a while for him to slowly and gently, I was always on time, always paid my bill on time. I was quoting Psychoanalytic Quarterly, the International Journal, Freud, Klein, Winnicott. And it took a while for him to point out and very gently show me that I was doing everything to be the patient I imagined he wanted me to be, in the hope that by somehow getting him to take a shine to me or like me, love me, that would somehow cure me, which is very different than letting oneself trust another human being. It's a kind of masquerade of surrender. And the one thing we talk about in the book is the way it can be a masquerade of love, that sort of submissiveness in a marriage or relationship. So the couch itself, yeah. And it is also the irony, even then I knew when he says this is the most comfortable, you also know it's going to be the most uncomfortable place you've ever been in your life when someone starts making some pretty penetrating and piercing interpretations. And I knew that even as he said that, and he knew that even as he said it. So, um, but he was a very special person, I think, in that he was a he trained many analysts in the British Society. He was in the independent group, and he very modest and very self-effacing, very thoughtful, and a kind of belief that we are fundamentally self-deceiving as human beings. But analysis can help us to lift our self-deception and begin what I describe as love's labor, the work of properly seeing ourselves and the people we love.
Yeah, yeah, yes, certainly. I mean, the threads that runs one of the threads that runs through this book is this idea of being able to see ourselves clearly and to see others clearly as is, in a sense, a condition for love. And also how this, as you were just describing, how this plays out in just your way of being with your analyst, right? And so quickly, you described this in the first chapter, of the book, and that's something that's a thread that holds psychoanalytic work together. The idea that the way a person lives their life with all their invisible entanglements shapes the way that they relate to their analyst, and how in analysis it has to be looked at and undone so that the person can have a chance to create a relationship with another rather than making the other kind of fit this sort of personal pattern. And the example that you give, you start off with yourself. Of course, the book is full of examples with your patients and with yourself and Dr. Lamentani. You know, you write, I think this is very interesting, but this is what you're saying, right? That you came to see that this was more than an underlying pattern. It was your life, right? It wasn't just a pattern in your life, it was your life. Earlier in the prologue, you wrote that love's labor, you just said it right now, is the work that we must do to see clearly ourselves and our loved ones in our attempt to join the world as it is. The world as it is, as opposed to the world and other people as we want them to be, which again is the heart of the
Or fear
analytic
that,
work.
or fear that they'll be. I think it's both our desires and our fears, and it's the kind of disentangling that and entering, yes, the world as it is. Or the Iris Murdoch quote that I have. I very much loved Iris Murdoch. I think that passage that you're citing, I love where she says, love is the perception of individuals. This seems so analytic to me. Uh, Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. And then she goes on, she says, love is the discovery of reality. And that's so it for me. That's true of what love is, but I also think that's what analysis is all about. And I have to say, perhaps I would say that's what life's about. That's what we should be doing, is trying to see ourselves, the people we love, and the world around us as clearly as possible.
There's definitely, I think, this sort of ethics to life, I think, that comes across in the psychoanalytic method, and how to live one's life and how one lives one's life and the analysis in regards to the analyst. This idea, that one relates to the analyst and according to one's fears, for example, and sort of creates this relationship with the analyst that actually avoids contact with reality is extremely important. I wonder if, and it seems to be also an idea that cuts across analytic traditions. You were mentioning Dr. Limentani and the British independent tradition. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your background tradition, psychoanalytic tradition, and your way of working that might be unique to other uh, traditions.
It's hard to describe because I'm I sort well, it's not, I mean, I can not that hard to describe to you because you're an analyst and you'll understand. I was analyzed by Dr. Limentani, but probably the supervisors, I was supervised by Hannah Siegel for many, many years and in her seminar. So I had a lot of Kleinian supervision and work. Um, and also a lot of work for over many, many years with Joe and Anne-Marie Sandler. So I'm someone who was in all benefited from therapy, from analysis, from all three groups. And of course, I'd had therapy in the States before coming over to England. And I'm someone who believes that I sort of think of myself as a psychoanalyst, like someone might say they're a physicist. They're not a Newtonian or a Heisenbergian or something. I'm not a anything but an analyst, and that means um, I sort of use the ideas and the things which I think are most helpful in that circumstance with that patient. I had wonderful teaching and I tried to give a picture of some of that with Harold Stewart, who was an independent analyst, a training analyst. He was a GP for many years before. Uh, Also Mervyn Glasser, who was head of the Portman Clinic, the idea of the core complex. He was very interested in perversions and sexual delinquency. I worked there in forensic psychotherapy under Mervyn and learned a huge amount from him, as I said, from the Sandlers. Many people, the Laufers, supervised me, and I mentioned them, I think, in the first book. Other people as well, whose papers I cite. I always try in my bibliography to encourage people to go off and read a lot of analytic things. So the things which help me and things that I love reading and go back to.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a little bit of the independent tradition, the British independent tradition, and a lot of that, also the work of the Sanders. And
Yeah.
it's you also mentioned in one chapter, at least at some point, it seems you also were interested in Anna Freud.
Yeah.
Of course, Freud. We'll
Yeah.
get to this at some point, but it's one of the best chapters, I think, or I mean, one of the best. It's hard to
Yeah.
choose, but one is when you begin to sort of distill the different psychoanalytic aims, by
Yes.
author and school of thought, which I thought was
Yeah.
fascinating. But
Yes.
we, Mhm, mhm.
Well, that chapter is was really important because it was really thrashing through what is the aim of analysis, what's it for, and I had seen this personal clash between two analysts uh, and wanted to describe it. It's a fictionalized story, but it's based on the idea of what is analysis about. Basically, in the story, one woman analyst runs off with another woman analyst's husband. And the first woman basically says, what kind of analyst are you? And she describes her view of analysis as being analysis is about respect, boundaries, not acting impulsively, respect for others, for yourself. That's real love. And the other person takes a very radical view that no, you go to analysis and you really look at your desires and your feelings. You really get to know yourself. And if you're prepared to pay the price for that, if it means blowing up your family or another family or causing upset, but if you really believe in what you desire and want, and this is the one life we have, then that's what you should go after. And she believes that's the aim of analysis, is to help us find that and find whether or not what we're prepared to do to live our desires, and so do. And that throws me into a long set of thinking about different people and a kind of memory of various people speaking about what the aim of analysis is. And it won't surprise you that I come to the view, I think, that the analyst really shouldn't hold a view that Dion would have held, or that I think Freud even held, that actually having desires like that are part of therapeutic zeal and are in a way a kind of cruelty to the patient. It's an imposition on the patient. In a sense, the patient should be making up the desires of what they believe the aim is, not the analyst imposing an aim on the analysis. Or in other words, an analysis might have many, many different aims. But ultimately, I rather liked I put the quote in because I liked it so much, beyond saying to his patient, I don't know why you're so angry with me. I'm not trying to help you, uh, which I thought was rather wonderful, meaning the medicine of psychoanalysis is understanding. That's what we do. We understand. We're not there to help. Helping is a problem. I can help my friend. He's in a bad marriage. I can move his stuff with him to another apartment or something. But the next week, he can be in a worse relationship. I mean, ultimately, I'm not helping him. Deep help, or kind of the medicine, as I say, of the real care, is that sort of deep understanding where he might think, oh, wait a minute, uh, and learn something about himself. So that's, I like, it was an opportunity, that story was an opportunity to think through all that about what's analysis for. And that was very important to me. It was something I was really feeling and thinking about at the time. And I wanted to write it up in a way that captured that.
Certainly, I think that's one of the most fascinating chapters. The people that you fictionalize having this discussion, Cora and
Susan.
Susan, in the way that they saw the psychoanalytic endeavor, right? The aims of it, and it just brings to mind this idea of an ethic of how to live a life. And
Yeah.
I remember somewhere, I can't remember where, reading Antonino Ferro talk about something along the lines of outside of the analytic office, the analyst is just, himself. He's, a regular person with his kids. He's a slob if he's a slob. He's sort of, he has all of his feelings in a different way, or that he might in the analytic consulting room where, there's a different way of being, but there's something about the frame, there's something about life, but there's something about what it means to live a good life, I think. And back to the examined life, the first book, or just the idea that Aristotelian or Socratic idea of what does it mean to live a good life, a life of wisdom born out of self-reflection, everyday self-reflection or experience. And what does that mean? And the psychoanalysis sort of teach that. I think what you're describing makes a lot of sense. The analyst does not impose his way of life on the patient. It's up to the patient to choose their path in that sense, how they want to live
Yes.
their lives. The analyst listens. But there is something about these two I like paradigms. It's one psychoanalysis that has to do with like both Susan and Cora agree that the psychoanalysis has something to do with knowing one's desires.
Yes.
And that there's consequences and implications, that there's a world out there too, vis-a-vis one's desires. But it seems as if Susan has her notion of health, at least, has an idea of the self in relation to others. Going back
Yes.
to beyond, let's say there's a sort of the group, and that there's something about my or the neighbor, let's say,
Yes.
and that there's some my health um, is contingent in a sense to my neighbors, and that
Yes.
the neighbor in a sense is an extension of myself, and
Yes.
that the in that sense the aim is sort of creating and protecting my relationships with others. That's sort of health. Well, there's this other point of view, which is, I think, Horace, and maybe that dichotomy isn't so stark, but Horace feels a little bit more individualistic in the sense of maybe Freud's group or the civilization, where it's
Yes.
me against the others. Perhaps against is not that, but the aim of analysis is to understand myself, my needs, and
Yes.
to get my needs met. And it's not necessarily me in the group, although I'm in the group. It's sort of me despite the group, it seems. And
Yes.
so
Well,
there's,
I
yeah,
actually quote, what I say, Susan's view. You're absolutely right, and your summary is excellent. And it is about the group. And in fact, the passage is, I remembered Isaiah Berlin's two essays on liberty, where he says something like, what's good for the pike is death for the minnow. In other words, he had this, the pike will, might be is big and can eat everything, or his notion too that your freedom to swing your arm ends at the tip of my nose. You can swing your arm all you want, and good luck to you. But if it hits my nose, you're incurring on my freedom and my life. And then things change, and there's an ethics and morals. That was very much Susan's view. And Cora's view, on the other hand, was life is short, everything has a cost. You stay in a marriage, you leave a marriage, there's a price to that. Uh, and if you're prepared to pay the price of whatever it is, and you've discovered that, you've looked into yourself and seen your desires and all their complexities, you've been honest and truthful, and that's what you decide, that's what you should do. And I felt that those were views that I'd seen colleagues express and live. And I wanted to get them into a story with each other and a clash and think about it and try and thrash out what I thought about it. Uh, and get other people to think about it too. And they do. People get annoyed with me they believe, why aren't you more cross with Cora for behaving like that? And why don't you side with so and so? And that's also interesting too, because as analysts, I mean, to be honest, I barely know what's going on in my own marriage. I mean, how can I judge other marriages? I mean, I think as analysts, we know we can't judge people because we know so little of what goes on inside other people. And ultimately, if you think about the story too, we don't really know what's going on, even when people appear to have quite wonderful marriages, and I might be idealizing them or liking them or thinking, wow, who knows? Maybe, this is better. That's why I think the analytic position of helping the patient to discover for themselves their aims is so both ethically and intellectually, it feels to me so correct, so right. That's deeply moral. So,
Certainly, in particular with the idea, especially if we think about the idea of the unconscious and
yeah,
people not necessarily being aware of their aims or having aims, but then discovering through analysis that they have quite different aims.
yeah,
For example, and then speaking of relationships, one of them is the relationship between Ravi and Sonal. I think
yes,
Sonal, I think,
yeah,
and the chapter is called Lost Love. They seemed like a loving couple, right? But I mean, in all respects, they were a loving couple in the beginning, but whose relationship took a turn for the worse when Ravi began to suspect that Sonal was having an affair with a friend.
yes,
And then you write about this, interestingly, as a delusion that he was having, that he needed to create for himself as a way of attacking his wife's love, right, which he deeply envied. And Ravi, the patient Ravi, right, wanted to feel loved, yet he couldn't bring himself to feel it because it stirred too much envy. And you suggested that for Ravi to feel loved, that would mean acknowledging this is what you were saying earlier about surrender and surrendering to the fact that Sonal had something good of her own that he wanted, but that he didn't have. And he resented this. And there was something about appreciation. He couldn't appreciate and be
yes,
grateful to her as a person, right? With a separate existence who could love in return. So he withholds love from her, right? And even in her illness up until death. And what comes up here is this topic of envy, right? Which is
yeah.
such a simple, but yet such a simple, I shouldn't say, such a complicated, I think you find a very simple way to speak about a very profound, very complicated uh, emotion every single one of us has that drives so much of our relationships with others, but that the mere pronouncement of the word feels like an accusation. But you're able to even to talk to people about that. And I'm wondering if you could say something about that, about envy and gratitude and the role that it plays in human relationships.
Well, in that story, um, it's one of those things where he was a patient And I read the case one way, which was I read he had this delusion of his wife having an affair as a defense against love because of all the things that had happened to him when he was a child with his mother, his parents, their divorce, all sorts of things, where he was protecting himself against emotional surrender to her. The analysis was seemed to go places. He got seemed to be closer to her. Their marriage improved, and he left. 20 years later, she gets cancer. She's very, very ill, and she rings me to say he's got to come back and see you. He's worse than when he was when he first came to you 20 years ago, and he won't come. He won't go to marital therapy, and she's dying of cancer. And what I then saw and could then re-look back at the analysis earlier was it wasn't a defense against love as much as envy of her capacity for love.
Mm.
One of the things that I saw was the more loving that she was. There's a very moving moment where she told me on the phone she was making a kind of family recipe book for them, and her words were, and I'll never forget them, it's my way of loving them into their future after I'm gone. And you hear when you hear certain things, you'll never forget them, the kind of movingness of those words. And she made these books. Um, her daughters loved them, but he couldn't even open his and look at it. And slowly I began to realize, of course, that what he had was a kind of envy of her capacity. The more loving she was, the more. But then that helped me to think about all of us, the way we get trapped. Um, Philip Roth has this wonderful expression in his writing where he talks about the ecstasy of sanctimony, the way we can get caught in our arrogance, our eye rolling. How could you? Oh my God, you didn't do that again. The pleasure of being indignant with our partner, of being superior and looking down, and the difficulty, the refusal to do love's labor, come out from that and see the world from our beloved's point of view. We can get trapped in that world. And I think I say at that point that that what stopped us learning that the world was round wasn't ignorance, but it was the knowledge that the world was flat. And likewise, in analysis, I sometimes feel the great problem is not our patients' ignorance of themselves. It's all their ideas, their knowledge of, oh, I'm this and she's that. They know the world is flat. And it's that knowledge that blocks them seeing reality clearly, the thing that Iris Murdoch is saying that we have to do. And so it's heartbreaking in this story because it ends sadly because he doesn't see her and she can't get close to him, and he loses her months before he loses her forever. And it's we all know stories like that in analysis where we can't help someone to let go of their view, which can be our views of ourselves. It can be so painful to see ourselves as we really are. And the difficult work analysts have to do to try and help people sometimes to see something about themselves which is deeply unpleasant uh, and cruel. So
Yeah. Yes. There's so much more to say. I think our time, unfortunately, is short. But in this book, I mean, in this interview, we talk so much about remorse, authenticity, intimacy, love,
yeah,
envy, all of these things, the importance of relationships. You write a lot about the people that were important to you in your life. Your patients have been, still are very important to you. You still
yes,
think about them decades later, so thoughtfully. Your mentors, your supervisors, you really write quite deeply about their effects on you and how much you've also remember and miss talking with them. But there's my sense. at the end of the book was that you could have said so much more, and that you have so much more to say. And I wonder what are you working on? Are you working on something? What are you thinking about? What's the
I
future?
am. I am working on other things. I'm trying to work on what I consider some of the most difficult problems of analysis, things which we as clinicians find difficult, things which I feel are at the limit of our skill, and trying to understand why they are. Uh, and are there ways, what are the things that facilitate change when we think things won't change? So that means lots of different problems, but problems, I talk about it in this book, attachment to suffering, the way patients can feel more at home uh, in certain kinds of pain. That's what they grew up in. It's familiar and therefore safer than letting go of that and having pleasure or happiness. So some of the things that we work so hard to help our patients with, and yet, um, can get impasses and stuck. And what are the things that facilitate change at those moments? And what are the things that where we are colluding with that stuckness, and how to break that up? So that's something I'm thinking about. But also, I'm always trying to write from, as I did in this book, from the heart, from the things that mattered to me. Um, in the front of my notebook here, which I keep with me, there are two quotes. One is from Kurt Vonnegut, and he says, um, it's his advice to writers, probably much younger writers than me. It's his advice to writers saying, choose something that matters to you in your heart that you think should matter to your reader in their heart. And then he basically says, it's not your word hoard or your style, it's that which will get you readers. And the other one was Amy Goodman, journalist, investigator, speaking to students at Columbia, said something like, it was in an awards ceremony, said something like, she was telling them her advice about writing, and she said, go to where the silence is and say something about it. So go to where the silence is. And that's what I tried to do in both Examine Life and this book. I felt there was a kind of silence about the love that I really thought about and saw. And that's what I wanted to write about. And that's what I'm trying to write in the next book too, is just the stuff that I feel matters to me in my clinical practice. And I also feel that is, not being quite written about in the way that I would like to write about it.
Mhm.
So that's what I'm doing, Rodrigo. So,
Looking,
or trying.
looking, looking so much
Yeah.
forward to it. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you
Oh, it
for
was a
this
real pleasure
interview.
talking to you. It was a wonderful interview. Great questions. And it is a unique pleasure talking to colleagues,
Yeah,
because I know you do this all day and you work with people. It really matters. So thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.